Well, change for me, John, is something that I've always sought out, actually. Reflecting, in preparation for this conversation, I had our first need as humans is certainty, but our second need is variety. And I had a very stable childhood, which meant I have sought out change and continue to seek it out all of my adult life, really. But as some of the stories I'll share with you, it doesn't mean that I was prepared for the impact of change, even
Very
though
good.
I sorted it out. Yeah, I'll sort it out. Yeah.
Very good. So when you say you had a childhood that was very stable, do you want to enlarge upon that first before you talk about all the change you've had in your adult life?
Sure. Well, I'll be really honest in this conversation. As you look back on your childhood, it's always normal, isn't it, at the time, because nobody knows what normal is. So my mum's from Northern Ireland. My dad's from down south in the south of England, but I live in a very small Welsh village on the River Dee. And not a lot of change. There were only 7 children in my primary school class, only about 50, I think, in the whole school. Very farming area. So although that was a very stable and very kind of nuclear family environment, looking back, I did always feel different, like I didn't quite fit in. And I think that's where the driving force of change came from, because I didn't feel that I really belonged. So as soon as I got to 18, I'd gone to the local comprehensive, the local sixth form college, done A-levels, and I was off then to the bright lights of London, qualified first as a physiotherapist from King's College London. And that was my first huge change from a very small 7 in the class to the might of King's College London. Was a pretty big change.
Yeah, I grew up in a country area myself. The town that I live in was a much smaller village many years ago when I was growing up. So looking back, you've talked about your childhood there for a couple of seconds or minute or so, and now you moved on to London. So you moved from a rural village to the capital of the UK and one of the biggest, if not the biggest cities in Europe. How did you cope with that change from going to London? How did you cope with the tube, with all the people around you, crowds here, crowds there, crowds everywhere? How did you cope with that?
Brilliantly, honestly, loved every minute of it. And on self-reflection, the work I do now is all about strength psychology and about energy. So I see now why, because I'm actually naturally energized by flexibility, by resilience, which is a kind of it can be a natural strength. I know we talk a lot about resilience these days, almost in terms of teaching it. But what I see now is I actually did that degree because as a natural resilient strength, a teacher said to me, physiotherapy at that time, and maybe even now, was one of the most popular courses in the country. And I remember the moment when a teacher said, you could apply, but it's hundreds of people applying to each space. You won't get in. You say that to a child with that kind of like to prove people wrong, which is what my resilience shows up as. So I go off to London full of energy, play to all of my kind of natural strengths of kind of, I can do this and this is going to be amazing. I've natural enthusiasm as well for change. So all of these changes, I really welcomed them. And I'll come on to even more significant ones as we go through, I'm sure.
So you moved on from college, went out to the workplace, you then found love, you got married. And you married into the army, I suppose you could say. Your husband is an army officer.
Yeah.
How have you coped with all the changes over the last number of years of your marriage, where you've moved from country to country or from base within country to another base in the same country? How have you coped with all those changes in your life? Particularly since your family.
Again, John, it was something I did welcome, I'll be honest, but that doesn't mean, like I've said, that you're prepared for it. So first of all, I had to change my career. I may well have changed from physiotherapy anyway. I've now gone into psychotherapy because I was always more interested in the mind. So it has been a great gift to me, kind of working with a lot of soldiers, a lot of families going through those changes. But yeah, initially it was full of excitement, I'll be honest. So I left Edinburgh. My first job was over the last, so to put it in context, I left at age 18 from my little village. I've returned back here. That's where I'm sitting now, back in the same little village. But I was away for 18 years. And in those 18 years, I moved 16 times. And I had around 11 different jobs. So a lot of house moves. I've lived in different places around the world, not all to do with the army, but to do with opportunities that the army put my way. Let's put it that way. If my husband's away for 6 months, I've been out living in Australia for 6 months and things like that before the children came along. But as postings, we've lived in Germany, a couple of postings in the south of England. We've lived up in Inverness. We lived out on the prairies of Canada. And like I say, I've lived out in Australia, New Zealand, and travelled the world. So I loved the change until the point when, if you want me to talk about the moment when it really actually hit me, would you like me to go on to that?
Carry on, yeah, of course. Yeah. The audience wants to hear.
So the changes were okay, I embraced, as I say, with my natural enthusiasm, my natural sort of resilience and flexibility. I was kind of like, what an exciting thing to do, didn't really think anything beyond that. But it got to the point, it was, I think, around sort of December 2012, and I'm standing in my kitchen up in Inverness. We're living in an army quarter, and I haven't really seen my husband at that point for most of the year before. So he's now at this point out in Afghanistan. He went out in the September before that. Our 2 children by this point are just 2. Our daughter's just turned 2 and our son is 5. And that's when I realised all of my preparation, all of my resilience, all of my enthusiasm, flexibility, suddenly it kind of hits that I don't really know how to deal with this. And that's when it hits me that the wives around me are not okay either, and I start to learn that the statistics of military wives are they're self-medicating. These soldiers are out in Afghanistan for 7 months. They've been away for months on end training before that. And the wives start to self-medicate. That might be alcohol. It might be prescription medication. It might just be withdrawing from the world and not getting dressed for days on end. I'm not saying all of them, but that's when I started to have that awareness. And for me, I noticed I was scrolling on social media. I was becoming angry at my children. I was stressed and I was afraid, basically. I'd never had to live before with that constant feeling of, if I see the chaplain or the padre, we would call him, and the welfare officer coming towards my door, that means my husband's either not coming home or he's coming home physically or psychologically differently. This is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Am I going to have a knock on my door or a phone call that tells me something's, an IED or something's gone off and hit him in Afghanistan? So that was really tough.
Of course, I can understand what you're saying there, because, in any sound marriage, both, people in the marriage contribute to running the home, and you're worrying about your husband. He's out in Afghanistan. The situation out there was very unstable. So I can empathize with you and understand your feelings. And at the same time, you're on your own at home with 2 young children, age 5 and 2 respectively, and you're trying to manage the family home as well as, keep the show on the road. But at the same time, there's always that lingering worry in the back of your mind that your husband could at any second, step on an IED, and then, it's all over. There's that worry behind you all the time. So I can empathize with you there. Yeah. So how did you manage to cope with that stress, that worry? Did you reach out to people to get help?
I didn't really, if I'm honest. I think I did what a lot of people think in these kind of times. You sort of think, maybe it's just me, maybe everybody else is actually coping fine. So I honestly looked around at my fellow officers' wives and thought, maybe they're better at this than I am. They seem to be fine and maybe I'm not. So what I actually did, John, is not really talk about it. What I did is just go inside and sort of think, I'm not who I want to be. I remember a phrase, I love favourite band of mine is called Delimitri, they're Scottish, and it says something like, when you look in the mirror, do you see the person that you always hoped you would be? And I kind of looked in the mirror and thought, this is not the person I hoped I would be in this situation. This level of change and uncertainty and fear is turning me into somebody who's angry at my children, feeling not good enough within myself, and saying to myself, I can't do this. And that is a journey that I then went on to say, well, if I can do this, or if other people do this, what do they do? So that led to me publishing a book. I mean, I was looking at the poster on my kitchen wall, the Keep Calm and Carry On poster. I even have the same poster now. We must have bought it from a tourist shop at some point. So everyone, I think, will be familiar with that Keep Calm and Carry On. So me, as this military wife, thought, what does that mean? So I went and found out, and I was just there researching really this word resilience that I thought I know what it meant. And what I discovered was it boiled down to how we talk to ourselves, how we feel about ourselves. Like, I describe it as kind of like a storm lantern. I even actually have it here because, again, I have it with me all the time. What I realized was the light of your own self-worth, your own self-esteem, your own self-confidence, however you describe it, that's the only thing you can control in situations that are completely out of your control. It kind of felt to me like the storm of the world was, the thunder, the lightning, the wind, the rain, and this metaphor was everything that I couldn't control that was then starting to control me rather than me having any influence on it. So that really turned it around for me. I started finding inspirational quotes, and I was working as a therapist by that point. I'd qualified through the army. So my clients started to tell me their stories of how they'd kind of kept their self-esteem up, how they'd kept being the author of their own story, how I'm going to come through this. And that's what I put in the book, like my story, their story. And I called it Stay Calm and Content, no matter what life throws at you. So it became a real period of growth for me.
And now that you have your own clients, you've gone from being a physiotherapist to psychotherapist. I think, aren't you now a hypnotherapist?
Yes, clinical hypnotherapist, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I stumbled over the word there.
Psychology coach, yeah, lots of different things.
Yeah, so what do you say to your clients when they come to your studio and they want help? They're having difficulty to cope with change.
It's one of my favorite things, because what I would do first of all is I believe, well, I know through the work I do, we're actually hardwired to be able to deal with this life of ours. Yes, it feels very unpredictable and scary, but it's actually always been unpredictable and scary. So one of the things I tap into is, we're like the survivor of 8,000 generations or something like that, of survivors of survivors of survivors. So the first thing is to say that when clients come to me, they're feeling like I felt at that time in my kitchen, in Inverness with my husband on the front line. Often they're overwhelmed, they're scared, they think they can't do this, I'm not good enough, I don't have what it takes. So the first thing I do is to say, no baby is born on the planet, thinking I'm not good enough, I don't have what it takes, I can't deal with this. That isn't your original programming. But what can happen in younger years is we can be overwhelmed in our childhood. That can be trauma events, it can be, neglect, abuse, these kind of things. And then these can kind of be built upon. So a lot of the clients who come to me are struggling with anxiety, depression, panic attacks, but it's not actually in their adult life that the root of that lies. They think that they're not good enough as an adult, but actually they've picked up limiting beliefs as a child that they've then held on to unconsciously. And that's where the hypnotherapy comes in. So really what I do is empower people. I use strength psychology as well to recognize, like I said at the start, once you actually know what energizes you, know what makes you enough. For example, strengths just mean things like compassion, empathy, creativity, detail orientation, decisiveness. I help people to discover their fingerprint of them at their best, so that then if they draw on their natural energy, it's their way through the change, is what I'm saying. It's not, because I think a lot of what we do is, well, that was what I was doing up in Inverness. I was saying, well, how are they am I supposed to cope like that person's coping, or am I supposed to do what they're doing? And actually, no, you can find your own way. It's my way through. And that's when I look back at my challenging moments, I realize now that I used my natural strengths. I didn't know what they were at the time, but to write a book, that's a creativity strength. That's an enthusiasm strength. Go with what you care about and use that to get you through the things that you can't change what you can by playing to your natural strengths.
It's a great answer. So I've got a lot of takeaways from today's conversation. And the first takeaway I have is be prepared to seek out change. Don't stay put in your comfort zone. If we want to move forward in life, we all have to get out of that comfort zone and embrace a constructive challenge. And in conjunction with that, I think what you learned from the very early stages of your life, Kat, is be flexible, adopt a flexible mind. Don't have your values so set in stone that you can't adapt to change. You have to be able to compromise with people or to collaborate with people. Sometimes that means giving up something very small that's important to you. You've got to look at the bigger picture and embrace that constructive challenge.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, you talked today about the dangers of self-medicating, and that can lead to many dark places, whether that's alcohol or self-medicating on prescription drugs, for example. You have to be prepared to ask for help of the right people.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned about, being stoic. It's fine to be stoic, but, you get people who cover up the real thoughts and the real feelings inside themselves. They look happy on the outside, but on the inside, they could be very vulnerable. They could be very upset, very emotional. And you talked about then coping with change to identify what your strengths are. And you talked about creativity, and that helped you to write your book. And then finally, you talked today about transitioning from being a physiotherapist to a psychotherapist into hypnotherapy. I'm stumbling over that word again. Hypnotherapy, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, very good.
And into speaking now as well, which is another huge comfort zone, as we know.
Great stuff. Yeah, great stuff. So this has been a very interesting conversation. And you talked about also the fact that, there was a stage in your life when you realized that change wasn't everything you thought it to be, and you were influenced by outside forces. Your husband being in Afghanistan, you were more worried about his life in Afghanistan. That influenced your whole thinking about change, and you had to overcome that. And the way you did it was to use your creativity to write that book, to get your thoughts in paper, to get your feelings in paper, and then to help people to overcome their stresses in life. So this has been a great conversation today. So is there anything else you'd like to say before I let you go?
I think just as you were speaking there, it reminded me of another metaphor about the self-medicating, that we can, because we like certainty, or we think we do as human beings, we end up putting ourselves in an invisible cage that sort of feels safe. And that's where we can limit our, with the self-medicating or the holding ourselves back. So I think I just want to express gratitude in a way for my accidental journey into all of this change. What it has taught me most of all is that staying out of that cage of certainty is okay. Like it can feel it. I've had so much change over my life, but it's ultimately meant that it's become familiar to me. And if I hadn't had to keep leaving and changing, I wouldn't now be a flourishing, hopefully, public speaker and therapist, because I've sort of literally created my own job. And I am very thankful of that, that if I'd had the normal run of the mill, it's harder to break out of a cage, I think, that you've sort of been put in and think it's too scary on the outside. But because all of that was broken apart for me time and time again, I kind of learned to just survive in the wilderness, if we put it like that. And I help others now to reach that potential, just to go out, not to let fear hold you back, break the cage of certainty, go out there and see what variety and change can hold for you.